Hello, welcome to the Davis Museum's virtual conversation, Past and Future Ruins, co-hosted by the Davis Museum and the Frost Center of the Environment. My name is Regina Gallardo. I'm a junior from Mexico City, studying art history and Latin American studies. We will begin with a native land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Wellesley College is built on ancestral and traditional land of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the United States' removal, termination, and assimilation policies and practices resulted in the forced settlement of indigenous lands and the attempted erasure of indigenous cultures and languages. We further acknowledge the oppression, injustices, and discrimination that indigenous people have endured, and that there is so much work to be done on the important journey to reconciliation. We commit to strengthen our understanding of the history and contemporary lives of indigenous people and to steward this land. We further recognize the many indigenous people living here today, including the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Mi'kmaq nations, who have rich ancestral histories in Wellesley and its surrounding communities. Today, their descendants remind us that they're still here, where they maintain a vital and visible presence. We honor and respect the enduring relationship between these people and this land, as well as the strength of indigenous culture and knowledge, the continued existence of tribal sovereignty, and the principle of tribal determination. To participate in today's program, please note that this event is being recorded and will be made available in the coming days. We are using a webinar format, and your microphone and video have been turned off during the presentation. Throughout the event, you can use the Q&A box to enter your questions. Live captioning is provided through a Zoom webinar. You can turn it on and off with the closed captions button in the features bar, which is at the bottom of the screen. Now, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Nicole Berlin, Assistant Curator of Collections here at the Davis.
Thank you so much, Regina, for that wonderful introduction. So I'm Dr. Nicole Berlin, the Assistant Curator of Collections at the Davis, as Regina mentioned, and I'd like to introduce our two other panelists who will be joining me today. First up, we have Dr. Carrie Cushman, who is a curator and educator specializing in the histories of photography in modern and contemporary Japan. She holds a PhD in art history from Columbia University and is the former Linda Wyatt Gruber Class of '66 Curatorial Fellow in Photography here at the Davis Museum. In May, Carrie will begin at the University of Hartford as the Edith Dale Monson Gallery Director and Curator for the Josloff and Sleep Galleries at the Hartford Art School. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Carrie's writing appears in edited volumes, international exhibition catalogs, and scholarly journals, including the Review of Japanese Culture and Society and Verge, Studies in Global Asias. She's currently teaching a seminar on the history of Japanese photography at Boston College. We are also joined by Professor Erich Hatala Matthes, who is an Associate Professor of Philosophy and Faculty Director of the Frost Center for the Environment at Wellesley College. His teaching and research focus on the ethics, politics, and aesthetics of art, cultural heritage, and the environment. So thank you so much, Carrie and Eric, for joining us today. I should mention that each of us are going to give a sort of brief introduction. Myself and Carrie will talk a bit about the exhibitions at the Davis that brought us all together and put us in conversation. And then Eric will give us some great information about the aesthetics of ruin and how we can think about them more philosophically. So I'll go ahead and get started, followed by Carrie and then Eric. And after our brief presentations, we will open it up to the audience, and we look forward to discussion and questions. So let me go ahead and get my screen sharing. So can everyone see that okay? I'm guessing so. Okay, so I'm very excited to speak with Carrie and Eric and you all, but also to tell you a little bit about the exhibition, this exhibition that I curated, which is titled "Picturing Pompeii: Archaeology and Early Travel Photography," and it is on view in the Davis Museum galleries until June 5th. So even though this is a virtual program, we very much encourage you to come to the Davis and come see these exhibitions in person. So I should say that I am a classical archaeologist and art historian of the ancient Mediterranean by training, but I noticed after starting at the Davis in 2020 that there was this fascinating group of photographs of Pompeii, and so I sort of earmarked this group of photos as one that might be interesting for an exhibition. And lo and behold, the opportunity came to take them from print storage, and exhibit them. So for anyone who's not quite as familiar with Pompeii, I should say that many people know the history, but just in case, Pompeii was a small but quite prosperous town in southern Italy. I would say about 2 hours from Rome as the crow flies, if you're driving or taking the train. And in 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius, which you'll notice just throughout the exhibition below the title and in a lot of the photographs, Mount Vesuvius erupted and covered the entire city in pyroclastic flow and preserved much of the city, including a lot of the organic materials, which is quite rare in terms of ancient Mediterranean archaeology. So the explosion of Mount Vesuvius was known throughout history. It was discussed in sources throughout modern history, but it really wasn't until 1748 that King Charles VII of Naples, who was known as Charles III of Spain, decided to undergo a systematic excavation of the ruins. So at the time that Charles was excavating at Pompeii, the whole city was covered in multiple feet of volcanic debris, and then land and earth that had accumulated. So it was quite an endeavor. So they started rooting around in the area where they knew Pompeii was, and started coming across wall paintings, mosaics, sculptures, and all sorts of hints that they had in fact hit the ancient city. I will say though that the important thing to realize about these early excavations, the first excavations in the 18th century of Pompeii, were that they were really a treasure hunt. So Charles, as a Bourbon king, was much more interested in unearthing artistic treasures, if you will, than undergoing any sort of systematic or scientific excavation of the city. So he was essentially digging tunnels throughout ancient Pompeii, pulling up things that were interesting and putting them in his palace to display them. So this kind of treasure hunting excavation of Pompeii continued well into the 19th century. And we come to a turning point in the middle of the 19th century, because this is when the unification of Italy happened. So Italy was a series of different kingdoms and states and cities up until 1861, when it was unified. So by that point, the Bourbon rule, including Charles and his descendants, had been kicked out of southern Italy, and the whole state was unified. So with the unification of Italy came the development of industry, including railroads. And so by the mid 19th century, there were rail networks connecting the country from north to south. And what this meant is that it was a lot easier to get to southern Italy than it ever had before. So Pompeii, beginning with its excavation in the 18th century, had been a stop on the Grand Tour, which is, and I say that with a capital G, capital T, which were travels that the British, largely British, but sometimes those from the continent, British elite nobles would tour around Italy and Greece to see the sights and sounds and ruins of antiquity and the cities that developed on top of them as a way of sort of reaffirming their socio-political status. So Pompeii had been visited by tourists somewhat sporadically in the 18th and early 19th century, but those visits were really limited to the very wealthiest in society. And so by the mid 19th century, tourists, middle-class tourists from both America and throughout Europe could get to Pompeii in a way that was somewhat affordable. So tourism in Italy really grew hand in hand with the unification of the Italian state and the availability of railroads. So at the same time, even at the same time as even this growth in tourism, you also have the simultaneous development of the medium of photography. So by this period, by the mid 20th century, I'm sorry, mid 19th century, photography had become affordable enough that one could print photographs on paper fairly inexpensively. So it still wasn't the case that people had their own cameras and could go around and take personal photographs, but they could go to photography studios for portraits. So we see the rise of portraiture available to many levels of society at this point, but we also see a rise in what's known as travel photography or tourist photography. So all of these tourists who were flocking to southern Italy and were flocking to Pompeii were interested in bringing home mementos from their travel. And they could do that in the form of either individual prints that they would order or pre-assembled albums. So this image here is an installation shot from the exhibition. So the introductory text and the first group of photographs. And after sort of introducing the exhibition and the history of the excavation at Pompeii and the rise of photography, I move into three different independent sections of the exhibition. The first one is focused on this rise of travel photography and the sort of intersection of tourism and photography at Pompeii. And I focus in particular on the Italian photographer Giacomo Brogi. So Giacomo Brogi is one of the most successful commercial photographers in Italy. He and the other photographer I'll be talking about in just a minute, Georgio Sommer, they set up photography studios in southern Italy. And these photography studios allowed for portraiture, but they were also producers of travel mementos for tourists from Pompeii. So as I mentioned, by the late 19th century, cameras were too expensive for individual people to own, but they did want photographs to take home to commemorate their travels. So this slide is actually a catalog from Brogi's studio from 1912, so a little bit later than the photographs in the show. But this is a page that shows you some of the photographs that were available for purchase from Pompeii. The 4-digit numbers in the left column correspond to particular images and were also printed on the photographs. So we'll see that in just a minute. For example, the number 5045 represents a series of photographs from the house of Marcus Holconius. So the catalog entry also gives you the exact location of the house at Pompeii and the different size options in terms of what you could order. And in this catalog, which has 6,000 different images available for purchase, over 100 were from Pompeii. So this tells you just how in demand the photographs were. So this is one of Brogi's many photographs. It's a scene from, it's a snapshot from the house of Marcus Lucretius Fronto, who was an elite homeowner in Pompeii. And if you can see here at the bottom, this is the number that I mentioned, that you would go into the catalog. Remember that you had visited the house of Marcus Lucretius Fronto and order the photo. So the number in the catalog corresponded to what you see on the photograph itself. Part of the fun of this exhibition was doing research with my curatorial research assistant, Dominique. And together in looking through photo archives, we were able to identify that this group of photographs were taken by Giacomo Brogi, and also that they were likely taken between about 1870 and 1880. This was the key time period for when he was taking photographs of different sites at Pompeii. So this is an example of just some of the many, many photos that he took. These are the ones that we have in our collection at Pompeii, at the Davis. And we have a wide variety of subjects from the ancient amphitheater at Pompeii, where there would have been gladiator fights, to different private houses, the gardens of different houses, like the one of Marcus Lucretius that you see here, to the museum that was built in 1873 that was used to house and display all of the materials from Pompeii. So the next section of the exhibition focuses on the German photographer, Georgio Sommer. So Sommer first came to Italy in 1853, and from that point forward became one of the most successful. He came in 1856, and within a few decades created one of the most successful and prolific photographic studios in the country. And what's interesting about Sommer is that he started working very closely with an Italian archaeologist by the name of Giuseppe Fiorelli. And Fiorelli was the first archaeologist to use modern scientific methods while excavating at Pompeii. Fiorelli used stratigraphic analysis, and he also emphasized that the context and find spot of an artwork were just as important as the artwork itself. So this contextual approach to archaeology is very different than what we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, where King Charles VII of Naples was pretty much going around and just treasure hunting throughout the city. So Fiorelli employed this more scientific approach to the city for the very first time, and he commissioned Giorgio Sommer to photograph a lot of his excavations and to photograph and document what he was finding. So this work with the emerging science of archaeology profoundly impacted Sommer's approach to photography. This is one of his photographs. He was working at Pompeii from about 1860 to 1890. And this is a photograph taken from the top level of the large theater at Pompeii. And it's a bird's eye view looking over the stage of the theater and then a series of other complexes. And this bird's eye perspective that you see in a lot of Sommer's photographs were appealing both to archaeologists and to tourists, because they really give a sense of the scale of the site and just how large it was. So these are some of Sommer's other photographs that are in our collection, including a variety quite as varied as we saw with Giacomo Brogi in terms of private houses, larger monuments like the Temple of Isis, and bird's eye perspectives like the one that we see from the theater at Pompeii. And finally, the last group of images from the last group of, I should say, objects from the exhibition are ones that were actual mementos that one could take away from Pompeii. So as I mentioned, tourists could either have printed out and purchase individual photographs and put them into an album themselves, or purchase pre-assembled albums like the one that you see here. So in this album in particular, from the late 19th century, there are a series of 56 different images of Pompeii. And what's fascinating about this is that you start to see the codification or the standardization of images from Pompeii. So the image at the left is from the album, and the image on the right is one of the photographs taken by Giacomo Brogi. And you'll see that it's almost identical in terms of the angle, in terms of having Mount Vesuvius in the background. And one other thing that I wanted to point out, which we have from Special Collections, who very kindly loaned it to us, is this stereo card from the late 19th or early 20th century. And this is absolutely fascinating because stereo cards were used to stereo cards had double images, and with a viewer, by inserting the slide, it would almost create a three-dimensional image of the city. So in this case, we have the basilica and forum of Pompeii. So it was a way of almost reconstructing your visit to Pompeii, and you could buy these individually to commemorate your trip. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Carrie.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Arthurina and Regina, for the introduction. And thank you for introducing us to the Pompeii photographs. It's so fascinating. I am also excited to share with everyone an exhibition that I recently curated for the Davis called Komatsu, Hiroko, Creative Destruction. Really a total environment photographic installation by the contemporary Japanese photographer Komatsu Hiroko. Komatsu Hiroko was born in 1969 in Kanagawa, Japan. It's near Tokyo. And she actually had an entire career as an experimental noise musician before training herself in mastering photography. So by her own admission, she came late to the medium of photography. And as you can see in this photograph of her in action on the right, she's really been making up for that delay ever since. So here she is photographing her own installation in the Davis Museum, which, as you can see, is made up of many different types of photographs that she uses to really just coat the entire environment in monochrome. So she's taking a really architectural, sculptural approach to photography. Some examples of the types of materials you see along the bottom. These are all individual 8x10 prints that have been stapled to the floor in a grid. Those extend up the back wall as well. These three objects on the back wall are styrofoam boards that have been wrapped in photos and then wrapped in saran wrap. Lining the walls are these huge two uncut rolls of photographs that extend around the entire gallery. And then those same rolls are draped across a series of wires to create this kind of photo forest on the other end of Levine Gallery. So what is she actually photographing? What is the subject matter, the content of the individual photos? Komatsu goes to sites that she refers to as industrial districts. And these are basically, areas on the periphery of urban centers where you'll have one large factory surrounded by a bunch of other smaller subcontractor factories. And she goes there religiously and systematically walks through these sites, very methodically photographing the types of objects that she encounters there. often piled up. And she describes a confusion that she often experiences at these sites where it becomes unclear, whether these objects are new or are they old? Are they things that are being prepared to send out to a new construction site, or are they something that has been just ripped from a demolition site and is on its way in transition to the dump? And because of this kind of ambiguity, this is where I, as the curator, brought in the idea of creative destruction to the exhibition. Creative destruction is an economic term. It was coined in 1942 by the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter to describe capitalism's need to create new markets, requiring the destruction of old ones. So in order for capitalism to sustain itself, it has to continuously destroy old markets in order to create new ones. And when that model is applied to an urban context, architecture is treated essentially like any other product under capitalism, as something that always needs to be refreshed and renewed and rebuilt. In the city of Tokyo, where Komatsu currently lives, a building's average lifespan is 20 years. And this has really been the case since Japan rebuilt from World War II, from the ashes of World War II, after the extensive Allied firebombing campaigns, and of course the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With notable moments of really unchecked urban redevelopment coming in the 1960s in preparation for when Tokyo hosted the Summer Olympics in 1964, and also during a economic real estate bubble in the 1980s. And so here you're looking at, on the right, a photograph of a demolition site during that real estate bubble in the 1980s, a prison that was being torn down to make way for a new shopping mall. And I think it's clear how, when at this point, even a demolition site, while ephemeral, if it is preserved photographically, can start to become indistinguishable from some of the iconic images of the ruined Japanese landscape of 40 years prior, after World War II. So although Komatsu Hiroko herself is not photographing ruins per se, I think that by engaging or enacting these ideas of creative destruction in her installation methods, she is creating a kind of photographic ruin that is indicative of the urban environment in Japan and increasingly elsewhere. There's a popular belief that there are no ruins in Japan because there is no equivalent of Pompeii. There's no equivalent of the Parthenon. There's nothing so monumental and permanent in terms of a ruin in the Japanese landscape, with the exception maybe of the atomic bomb dome in Hiroshima. But rather, ruins appear in the Japanese landscape as temporary and ephemeral. And they consistently reappear in the modern and contemporary eras. And photography proves this. One of the main motifs of post-war and contemporary photography in Japan are these moments of ruination that are repeated either in cycles of man-made redevelopment or ecological disasters. So here you're looking at an example of a demolition site photograph on the left here, in preparation for the Olympics I spoke about earlier in 1964. Here is an example of obsolescence, a building about to be destroyed in the real estate bubble in the 1980s, and on the right, Kobe after a major earthquake in 1995. So as I understand it, Komatsu, I think, takes this motif of what I call the temporary ruin to an extreme, creating an entire photographic environment that will ruin. Unlike cities, or like Tokyo, which are perpetually renewed, this exhibition as an environment will age. We already see examples of this. So this roll on the right that I've highlighted here with this red box actually came to us from a previous installation. And you can see in this lightened part of the roll how that is marked or aged, because that's where it had hung previously on the wire. So it had a higher exposure to light and then was also damaged some by the wire. More obviously, the photos on the floor will be scuffed, they will be ripped, they will be ruined as more and more people make their way through this exhibition. And to me, what I find so significant about this approach is that it's an opportunity to make a gesture towards restoring a sense of history to the environment. And it's coming at another important historical moment when Tokyo has just again remade itself for the 2020 Summer Olympic Games, which were held last summer, delayed due to the pandemic. And you know, while Tokyo and the city and the government worked to present it as a very, you know, streamlined, pristine place to the world, Komatsu's practice is so important because I think it reminds us of two things. One, the destruction that is required to sustain that image of renewal. But then second, also the value of sometimes allowing things to age, allowing things to ruin, to have a patina, allowing there to be a sense of history in the built environment. So I will end it there and hand it over to Eric, who I think will tell us a little bit more about the aesthetics of ruins and our experience of them.
So thanks so much, Carrie. I'm going to kind of take over the screen sharing.
Oh, there you go.
Thanks. All right. Yeah, thanks so much to everyone for inviting me to join in this conversation today. You know, ruins are and have been a subject of a lot of attention philosophically and theoretically from, you know, philosophers, art historians, other theorists. And you know, one of the things that is so fascinating, I think, about ruins as an object of aesthetic attention is that on their surface, there's something sort of puzzling about our interest in them, our positive interest in them, something almost paradoxical. Because ruin, of course, on its face has a kind of negative connotation, right? We're like, we don't like things to be ruined in general, right? We want to, you know, keep them nice. But yet there's something that is, right, compelling and engaging to us about examples of ruin. And there's even this German term, Ruinenlust, right, that describes this kind of desire for ruins that people, right, across time and place have experienced. So that invites, you know, this interesting philosophical or theoretical question about what is the subject of our attention when we are engaged with ruins. What is it that we're aesthetically appreciating about them? And theorists have offered a variety of different kinds of accounts or explanations of you know, the object of our aesthetic attention when it comes to ruins. And some of them are in tension with each other. Others maybe are, you know, can be rendered compatible, just sort of different perspectives or ways of thinking about what we appreciate when we appreciate ruins. So I wanted to just sort of put on the table a number of different ways about thinking of our aesthetic appreciation of ruins that we can then sort of read into some aspects of the exhibitions that that Carrie and Nikki were just telling us about. So, you know, one idea that the philosopher Carolyn Korsmeyer has been a real advocate of is when it comes to thinking about ancient ruins in particular, there's this idea that they evoke a kind of thrill. There's a sort of sublimity about them, specifically with respect to how they seem to bridge gaps in time that are otherwise almost sort of unimaginable, right? So this is distinctive of ancient ruins in particular. So you might think about this with respect to Pompeii, for example. So in a paper, she uses this drawing on your screen right now by Henry Fuseli, which is a depiction of himself sort of overcome with emotion before the grandeur of ancient ruins in Rome, right? These are parts of the sculpture of Constantine, I think. So there's this sense that when we appreciate ruins, we're sort of keyed into this kind of emotional experience that is, on the one hand, pleasurable, but on the other hand, kind of terrifying or awe-inspiring, right? Much like you might think about the sublimity of nature and our aesthetic appreciation of nature, or aspects of nature, like the starry sky or mountains, right? Things that sort of fill us with a kind of awe that's both pleasurable and terrifying in terms of its immensity, right? But here, right, the immensity is the immensity of time that's represented by, right, these relics of a bygone age. So that's one way of thinking about what we might appreciate in the aesthetic appreciation of ancient ruins in particular. Another different way of thinking about it would be in terms of the sort of imaginative exercise and the imaginative pleasure that we might gain from thinking about the imagined whole that a ruin offers just a sort of a glimpse of or a part of. So, this, you wouldn't necessarily need to actually engage in the artistic practice of reconstructing the ruin as in the image here, but this is, I think, just sort of a nice illustration of the idea, right? So you can see this is somebody has set up a piece of glass and has, drawn out, right, the imagined whole of this ruin in Austria. So there you might think about, right, the object of your aesthetic attention as partially towards this imaginative exercise of creating something in the mind that is evoked and inspired by the ruined remnant that you have before you in real life. Another idea I think that's useful to think about here is a distinction that the art historian Alois Regel discusses between the age value that's represented by a ruin and the historical value that's represented by a ruin. So for Regel, historical value has to do with sort of knowledge of the past, and ruins can present a kind of value to us when we sort of know things about them, where they're from, and they can embody knowledge about the past. And so you might again think about this with respect to ancient ruins or even more contemporary ruins. But that can be distinguished from the idea of age value, or the extent to which a particular ruin shows the wear and tear of age, shows a certain kind of patina or evidence of the past. And you can even think about these two sort of coming together. So that this ties in interestingly with what Carrie was just saying about the way in which Hiroko's photographic practice, sort of through sort of showing the signs of age, can in turn be used to help sort of construct a certain kind of history or a record of history about, right, these architectural spaces that are in the process of being creatively destroyed. But the two can also come apart, like I was mentioning. So this is just a picture of a ruin from central New Jersey, near where I grew up. This is on the Princeton battlefield. And this is not the only example you see of this in the United States, right? These sort of, presentations of colonnades, things that have a sort of a Greek influence that have sort of signs and wear tear about them. They have sort of evoke that kind of age value of ruins, although they're obviously not ancient Greek ruins. I mean, this piece does have an interesting history, but I'm not going to get into that. But the point is that it's a history that is independent of any kind of ancient history, but that appreciation of the look of age can still be evoked, right, by ruins in that way. And this is a practice that we see in sort of parks and other public places across the country. A final idea I want to draw attention to is the way in which ruins can offer an opportunity for thinking about processes of change about ephemerality, as I think both Carrie and Nikki mentioned, and in particular the interplay of nature and human structures. So this is a famous painting by Turner of Tintern Abbey. I think evokes this idea really nicely. You have the ruins of the abbey, but they're really overgrown with this lush plant life. And so one thing you might appreciate in thinking about the appreciation of ruins is the way in which there's this dynamic interaction between nature and the built environment that we're often at pains to try to avoid, right? To keep separate, to keep nature from encroaching on the built environment. So it offers a different kind of opportunity to think about the interaction between those two. And I just want to sort of close by saying that, I think one of the things that's so interesting about thinking of these sort of different ways of considering how we might appreciate ruins aesthetically is that they might in turn inform sort of broader aspects of our aesthetic practice. So there's a quote from the philosopher Jeanette Bignell that I really like in this regard. She wrote, "How might our aesthetic practices change if we rejected the dichotomy between stable and ephemeral and strove to appreciate and enjoy even the most solid structures as if they were to disappear in a short time?" So the idea that if we take this perspective that anything that we encounter as an object of our aesthetic attention, no matter how permanent it might seem, right, has the prospect of coming to ruin in the future, right, has a sort of perhaps implicit ephemerality about it. How might that alter the way in which we approach it as an object of our aesthetic attention? So I will stop there, and I look forward to the further conversation.
So thank you so much for speaking us, to all the panelists to speaking us with us today. And again, thank you to all the attendees who joined us today as well. And there's a couple of questions on the chat. One it is by Professor Berlin Davis, and this is directed to Professor Matthes. Do you think that the kind of romantic view you showed at the end, where nature and art interact, is it still available to us? Professor Lynn Davis states that when she thinks about archaeological sites like, say, the Forum of Rome or Pompeii, there's something stripped bare about them.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it depends on how the site is maintained. So, one of the things that I think is important to how we think about ruins as objects of aesthetic appreciation for tourism particularly, is there's a lot of work that goes into maintaining ruined sites, right, so that they present a particular face for the tourist audience. And so, yeah, for a variety of ruins, that is like a very sort of stripped bare kind of presentation. And I think that ties in with some things that Nikki, Carrie, and I talked about previously about how these sites are often presented as well in when there are artistic presentations of them without people, right, tied into that sort of strippedness. And I think one of the things that does is it presents them as stages for people to engage in different kinds of imaginative activities, right, imagining themselves there, imagining for themselves what might have occurred there. And then I also think it has some darker sides to it because it allows opportunities for the use of ruins as political tools. And if we have time, so I have some extra slides about that as well. So I think it really just depends on the site and the way in which it is maintained, but maintenance and how it's maintained and how it wants to be, how whoever's in control wants to present it is key to which aspects of these objects of aesthetic attention are going to be foregrounded.
I would add that there are also examples in the world where nature has totally overtaken ruins and it is very self-consciously maintained. Like I'm thinking of the many ancient temples in Cambodia and Siem Reap, specifically Angkor Wat immediately comes to mind, where sometimes for structural reasons, a banyan tree has become so integrated with the stones there that they can't remove it. But other times for aesthetic reasons and for photographic reasons, because these make good pictures, they make good objects of contemplation for the reasons that Erich was just talking about, that are very romantic.
I think to build on the points that both of you have made, there's this sort of inextricable link between consumerism and ruins, and the aesthetics of ruins, that it's almost antithetical to this idea of the romantic ruin, where nature has overtaken and time has been allowed to lapse. But there's this this tension between that sort of timeless nature of ruin and this need to not only preserve them, like in the case of Pompeii or elsewhere, but the fact that ruins that are more appealing, like the Colosseum, like Pompeii, they're going to receive more funding to allow that site or that city to not fall further into ruin. So there's this kind of difficult relationship, I think, between aesthetics and this sort of frozen in time aspect of ruins with the commercial aspect, both in terms of preservation, travel and visitation, but also even just what we're talking about with photography, the fact that there's a whole industry rising around these ruins throughout Italy. There's I think that's sort of the aspect of this that no one wants to publicize or talk about as much, but is integral in thinking about in terms of the antithesis of natural ruin, if you will.
Yeah, I think it's also we're thinking about this point with the sort of the romanticism thing in relation to sort of trade-offs, right? So how much does the site manager want to allow for this kind of interplay between nature and object, given that, like Carrie noted, over time, right, that is not consistent with the long-term preservation of the site. So if you look up images of Tintern Abbey, like right now, it doesn't look like the Turner paintings, right? Like all of the vegetation has been removed, right? And because that's a trade-off, right? So you don't get that kind of romantic interplay between nature and structure, but what you do get is the longer term preservation of the site.
Thank you so much to our panelists. And there's two questions in the Q&A that I would like to address. And one of them deals with the process of demolition and with the idea of when modern ruins are demolished in the modern environment. And the other one deals with the appreciation of ruins in terms of loss. Especially, I want to read it because it's just very beautiful written, especially in the loss of the conditions of the possibility for the current day life, both human, more than human, in which we are hastening from anthropogenic change in the environment. So this idea of how do we deal with when ruins are no longer there?
Should we answer one first and then the other, Regina, or?
If you would like to start, Dr. Cushman.
I might be able to tie the two together, actually. So I have spent a lot of time thinking about the photography of demolition and why so many photographers in Japan photograph demolition sites. And I think it is because that is the main modern ruin in places that are subject to these cycles of perpetual redevelopment. In that sense, then, and this maybe ties into the next question, I think we're at a point where we need to start rethinking about our relationship to ruins as the appreciation of these permanent objects in our environment, and thinking more about ruins as events that come and go, with increasingly thinking about ecological disasters. These are ruinous events that people live through and that are then often covered up in the processes of redevelopment, which can happen sometimes, I think, too hastily. And interestingly, then, for the and I don't want to say appreciation of that ruin, because it becomes more of like an affect, like something we're all living with. But to tap into that memory, we'll say, of the ruin, that affect of the ruin, the ruinous event, requires things like photography and photographic images for us to be able to reflect on those moments.
Yeah, I think, Carrie, to your point in thinking about the role of photography as it plays into this idea of this great question about loss in ruins. With Pompeii in particular, photography, I think in a way allows you to appreciate the loss in a way that you may not be able to if you haven't visited the site, or even if you have gone to the site and have taken, you take photographs back. For example, a number of the photographs that we see preserved from this time period don't have people in them, a topic that we've been talking about. They don't have anyone in them because they want the photographers, and the general aesthetic was this desire to have, for the sort of backdrop of antiquity, so that any individual person could sort of map themselves onto the ruins. But what you do have are these casts of people who died in the eruption. And I think the photographs of these casts in particular highlight the fact that it's not that we just accidentally have this beautiful Roman town preserved, but there was a volcanic explosion and thousands of people died, lost their homes, lost family members. And that aspect of it, I think, is often lost. Even when you go to the site, there's almost like an ancient Disneyland aspect of it. I think you don't always get the seriousness of what happened. But there was also this fascination with these casts that were actually invented. They were invented. It was a method invented by Giuseppe Fiorelli, the archaeologist who worked with Georgio at the very beginning of the scientific excavation of Pompeii. And he developed this method of pouring plaster into these areas in the earth where someone had died. And so you get these very realistic looking molds of essentially a void where a body had been. And so you see quite a lot, quite often individual molds, but also the molds as they were presented in the Archaeology Museum. And it's clear from the photographic sort of practice around these molds that people weren't sure what to do with them, whether to think about them as human remains, to think about them as artifacts to be displayed. So I think this question of photography and loss really, it has a preservation aspect, but it also almost emphasizes loss because it is this sort of frozen snapshot of time. So I thought that was a really great question, and just wanted to think about that, especially in the case of Pompeii, where you do have this immense loss of life.
Yeah, and I think in respect to that second question as well, I think recognizing the extent to which ruin sites, or at least tourist ones or objects that are of aesthetic attention like them, are curated, maintained, presented in a certain way. Like once you recognize how much work goes into that, I think it helps to open up space for thinking, oh yeah, like you could present lots of different kinds of things as ruins. And there's a lot of control exerted over what's presented as a ruin and what that means. So here, I'll just show this real quick because I had it all set here. But one that I think about a lot, just because I'd written about it while it was happening a few years ago, was all the attention paid to the ruins of Palmyra in Syria. And we're often presented with images like the one on your screen, because that's sort of the contemporary shot of the ruins that we see. But those ruins themselves, were highly curated and maintained. So this is part of the same site. And you can see this is from the 1930s, when sort of French archaeologists came to excavate, and you can see all of the space here. There were actually lots of people living on the site of what is now the ruins of Palmyra. So there's intentional choices being made there about what to save or intentionally remove, destroy, displace in order to present a particular view of what ruins are like. And then with respect to that sort of backdrop or sort of stage setting, there's also, I think, and this ties into the idea of the sort of the sublimity of ruins. In removing people from ruins, in our presentations of them, they acquire sort of an extra timelessness to them, right? Because there are no sort of contemporary visual cues to knock you out of your sort of imaginative enterprise. And so we often get, oh well, this is another. This is as a stage setting. This was the Russian Symphony Orchestra performing at Palmyra after it was initially sort of liberated by Daesh. So that's using the site of ruins, their backdrop, as literally a stage for a certain kind of political performance. And then when you think about the sort of classic presentation of ruins as abandoned, empty, unpopulated, like this is Basra al-Sham in Syria, which is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Right, this is often what we see when we're presented with imagery of ruins, right? But that doesn't mean this is how they are all the time, right? So here's a group of activists making use of that site for a political protest. There are lots of elements that go into the significance of how these kinds of sites are portrayed and how they're used and deployed for various purposes, both aesthetic and political.
I'm so happy that you both, Dr. Berlin and Professor Matthes, you tackled in the idea of imagined ruins without people and the photographic aspect of how we interact with that, because there was a question in the chat about it, and I'm happy that it was brought up. For a closing thought, there's another question about the idea of how ruins change when they're embedded in new structures. And this is all for all panelists. I know we have a couple of minutes left, and I don't know who would like to have the final thoughts on that question. If any would like to answer it.
So I, as someone who works on the ancient Mediterranean, I think our experience of, I think it depends a lot in terms of our experience of ruin when they're in a new structure. I think it depends on what that structure is, and it depends on the context. For example, I'll use, only because it's one of my favorite things, with the various Antioch mosaics at the Davis Museum. I think just the decision about how one is presenting the material makes a huge difference in terms of how you're experiencing them, and having a mosaic on the floor where it's intended to be versus on a wall, I think makes a huge difference in how you are understanding and contextualizing the ruin for the viewer, for example. So even just decisions made about where something is located, I think can facilitate a recontextualization for the viewer, never mind photographs, didactics, etc. So I know we only have a few minutes, so I'll leave it at that so that Carrie and Eric can jump in.
I'll just add that, when I think about pieces of ruins being taken and putting like the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum that Martha brings up as an example, I think it's a great reminder of how these are fragments. And we can think of them almost like a collage, to the point Nikki was just making about recontextualization, how as fragments, they just tell us, about a piece of a moment in time and never the full picture. And to tie it back to the reason that we're all here, ruins and photography, that's what photographs do too. So I always think about, the similarities between how photographs function and how ruins function as fragments, moments in time that, going back to some of Eric's points, can do various things like spark our imagination, but also provide places where we can kind of embalm our collective or personal memories.
Yeah, I would just close out by emphasizing that personal dimension as well that Carrie talked about. So, yeah, on the one hand, sort of the absence of people from ruins allows, a variety of uses that I mentioned before. But, another, I think, just sort of more, quotidian one is it allows the possibility of presenting something as sort of yours in a way. So I think there's a lot of, similarity here between the sort of tourist image of ruins like Nikki discussed in Pompeii as being absent of people, or because like you don't want somebody else's family in your tourist ruin photograph. Just like when people go to national parks, right? There's tons of people there, especially during the pandemic, but everybody sort of jockeys around to try to get the picture of the beautiful vista without other people in them, because perhaps ironically or counterintuitively, keeping other people out of the picture, even though that's actually what you're experiencing, helps to facilitate this kind of like personal connection. Like, oh, this was the picture that I took that captures this site in all of its grandeur, and it's mine, and I can imagine myself there without the distractions of other people.
Very, very insightful comments. And I think that we're out of time. So thank you again to our panelists and all of those attendees who joined us today. Thank you again for the conversation, and hope to see you soon in another Dave's event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.